In her press conference today, Julia Gillard announced that the Independents had asked for assistance from wise elders, as she put it, connected to each of the major parties, who could provide advice about appropriate parliamentary reform and, quote, a changed way of doing politics, unquote. From the Labor side, she was specifically asked for veteran Labor election strategist Bruce Hawker, who has been involved in the establishment of three minority governments at state level. Bruce Hawker joins me now. So, Bruce Hawker, do you yet have any idea what's required of you or why you've been asked to provide advice?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that Rob Oakeshott is looking for much more consensus in the way in which Parliament operates. I think he's concerned that a bare majority of 76 is going to be unstable, and I think he wants to look for ways of making that 76 feel more like 86 if he can. And I think that'll mean looking at parliamentary procedures and probably getting a more consensus approach to the Parliament.
So, as I understand it, you've actually had some conversations with Rob Oakeshott over the months before the election. Now, how did that come about? Was that at your instigation or his?
Well, it was actually at his instigation. We were talking about a paper I'd given in Brisbane a couple of years ago about reforming executive government and ways in which you can enhance the quality of your cabinet by outside appointments. This was something that was of some interest to Rob, and we talked at length about that and other ways of making Parliament more accountable to, or the executive more accountable to the Parliament.
So in terms of that speech to the Brisbane Institute, you talked about looking outside the Parliament to enhance executive government or cabinet government.
That's right.
Is that where he's drawn the ideas that he was floating yesterday about going for a more bipartisan approach to government, in fact drawing on the best talent from both sides of Parliament to try and get this kind of consensus cabinet? It's a bit different from what you propose.
It is. I've never gone so far as to say you should have a government of national unity like you might have had in the Second World War in the UK. What I'm saying is more that you can draw people from outside the Parliament into the cabinet in the way in which they do in the United States and other jurisdictions in Europe, for example.
But that's that is the whole of the US cabinet. It is totally drawn from outside and from non-elected people. Now, you also quoted the South Australian example with Labor Premier Mike Rann, where he had not only a national party member as a minister, but two independents as ministers, well, one as Speaker and one as a minister in his cabinet. How well did that work?
It worked remarkably well. That government was very much in the minority when it was elected in 2002, but Rann managed to put together a cabinet and a government which had a National Party member in a senior position, an independent in a senior position, and they were given leave, if they gave him notice in advance, to actually vote against cabinet decisions in the Parliament if it went against their constituencies. So he gave them a lot of leeway in exercising their obligations to their constituents. This is the sort of thing I suspect that the three rural independents would be very interested in.
So that was a break with the tradition of cabinet solidarity, that they could speak their mind inside cabinet, but if the decision went against what they firmly believed in, they could still vote against it as independents.
That's exactly right. And that's a big departure from what we've expected of cabinet solidarity in the past, but it worked and worked very well. When he came up for re-election in 2006, he got a landslide victory and kept members of that cabinet from outside the Labor Party in his cabinet when it was re-elected in 2006. So Carleen Maywald, for example, the leader of the National Party, was a member of his cabinet from 2002 right through to her defeat in 2010.
And her association with that cabinet was what cost her the defeat in the end.
Ironically, it probably was, although there were a lot of issues to do with water and so forth in the Riverland that had a big impact. But the point is, you can do things which are novel and new, and if you're prepared to change your arm a little bit, you can change the face of governance in this country, not just the executive, but potentially the Parliament as well. And that goes to instituting changes in the way in which the Parliament operates on a day-to-day basis. You basically take a lot of the power away from the whips and the leaders of the business in the House and give it more to the Parliament to direct itself.
But isn't that going to go so much against the grain of the current cultures in both major political parties?
Well, it will. But political survival, I think, is a very compelling driver. And if it does change the way in which the Parliament operates, then I think most people who watch Parliament and tut-tut when they see the performances of ministers and opposition leaders will say, well, that's for the better. For example, you could change the way in which private members' bills are debated. You can actually give private members, backbenchers, crossbench members, the right to introduce their own bills and have them debated, as happened in New South Wales after there was a hung parliament in that state, and the independents gained the control of the parliament effectively by having a hung parliament.
Well, so just go to the New South Wales experience, because you were involved in negotiations with the independents as part of Bob Carr's operation, the Labor side, but in the end they formed an agreement with the Greiner Liberals to create a Liberal government, minority government. How stable was that minority government, and how effective was it in terms of legislative reform?
Well, in so much as it lasted the full term, it was very stable. On election night in 1991, we thought we were just days or weeks away from forming a government. We actually had to wait till 1995 and then just fall across the line in order to form a government. But the reforms that the independents drove in that parliament were quite remarkable. They changed the way in which estimates committees operate. In fact, they introduced estimates committees in New South Wales for the first time. So backbenchers, the opposition, were able to quiz ministers about the budget. They changed the freedom of information laws so that they were much more accessible to the public. They changed the number of standing orders, as I said before, to make question time shorter, questions faster or more quickly given, and more questions in question time. So they did a lot of things that actually made the Parliament more responsive. The downside was that the government had to respond constantly to the demands of the crossbenchers, and that's something that in this process that we're talking about now, talking with the independents and talking with the crossbenchers, we need to make sure that any reforms that happen are properly balanced so that the executive doesn't become totally beholden to the Parliament. That could be a recipe for no action at all.
Now, come back to the paper that you wrote where you talked about having a cabinet that was made up of substantially of a majority of elected ministers, but then others brought in to the executive in a form who were completely outside the parliamentary process. How responsive do you think the Gillard government might be to that idea?
Well, look, I don't know. But in principle, I don't think it's a bad idea, although it requires substantial legislative amendment to happen at a federal level. I think there's a lot to be said for increasing the gene pool of any cabinet. We shouldn't assume that the best brains in the country are always going to come from those who've been elected from the 150 people who make up the Parliament. There must be people out there who could be brilliant contributions to executive government in this country if the Prime Minister was allowed to appoint 4 or 5 from outside. Make them accountable to the Parliament, not give them a vote in the Parliament, of course, but make them accountable to the Parliament, make them attend committee meetings and do all the things that they have to do, require them to sign secrecy undertakings as required, but engender the Cabinet with some real outside talent that doesn't come from spending days and weeks attending branch meetings in drafty old halls in the suburbs.
Now, there's an irony in this conversation for me, and that is this, that at this last election, part of the reason it seems to me that we've got this outcome that we have of a hung parliament, which is, by its nature, a vote of no confidence directly in either side, there's a judgment, there's certainly a strong argument to say that a very big reason for that vote was that people were just turned off by the negativity and the cynicism and the attack elements of this campaign, this kind of race to the bottom as it's been so often described. Now, you're a Labor strategist who was very much a part of the shaping of that campaign from Labor's side. So that to me would involve a certain element of cynicism, but on the other hand here you are advocating parliamentary reforms which arguably would raise the standard of the Parliament. Now, there's a real contradiction in terms there, isn't
Well,
there?
I think you have to you really have to look at the two things separately to some extent. You have to look at the campaign and say, what's our best way of maximising our vote? Obviously, a lot of things went wrong in that equation. But on the other hand, how do you make the Parliament a more accountable body? I think this was a very tough campaign for various reasons. We've been through that, and we'll continue to go through that as the weeks and months go on. But it was hard for Gillard, I think, to really present a very positive picture to the Australian public because of a lot of interference that was happening in the course of that campaign. Now, that wasn't the only reason, but it was one of the reasons. On the other hand, I think the handlers of Tony Abbott did a very good job in keeping him essentially in cotton wool throughout the whole campaign. We didn't see the old Tony on display. Maybe we will in the future, but we didn't see it.
He might be a permanently new Tony.
He may be. We will see.
Bruce Hawker, thanks very much for talking with us.
Pleasure.